Greetings and welcome to a new narration by DrTorment. The following story may prove a little sensitive to certain viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised and consider this your one and only warning. Now with that out of the way, let us proceed.
In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the very presence of Almighty God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or even sense the outside world, he was all alone with just his thoughts. The scientists kept monitoring him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. But after 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it to be an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. Then 2 days after that, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking to him, and even more, he could communicate back. Of course, the scientists were intrigued, but were not thoroughly convinced. Not until the subject started naming the dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. As one can expect, at this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against a wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientist for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. And this tactic worked for at least 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. It was then that the subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his very dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now claimed that the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientist rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to the table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For about 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, He turned his head and, despite his blindness, made a focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time during the study. He whispered,
I've spoken to God, and He has abandoned us.
and then he ceased to move at all, and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death.
And so we've come to the end of our narration today. If you enjoyed this particular story, please consider giving it a thumbs up and comment your thoughts down below. Maybe even subscribe, as that will help out the channel immensely. I'll also invite you to check out the links in the description below, which leads to the story and its creator. Lastly, for those who are willing, consider having a look at our Patreon page in the link below and in the video, and consider aiding the channel in its grand goal to remove the ads from our videos so we can provide you with uninterrupted stories. This has been your host, DrTorment, bidding you adieu. And remember, don't fall asleep. Ever.